The paper landed on the table between them like a verdict, crisp and official, bearing the seal of the Cattlemen's Association of New Mexico Territory. Gertrude Doyle looked at it for exactly 3 seconds before she raised her eyes to Oscar Easton's face, and what she saw there made her chest tighten in a way she had not felt since the day she buried her father. "You already signed it," she said, not a question. Her voice did not shake, which was something she would later consider a minor miracle, given that her hands were absolutely shaking underneath the table, pressed flat against her thighs where he could not see. Oscar Easton stood at the far end of the kitchen, broad-shouldered and dust-covered from a long morning on the range, and he did not apologize. He simply looked at her with those gray eyes that she had spent 6 months trying not to trust and said, "The ranch will outlast any sentiment, Gertrude. That is the plain truth of it. The plain truth." She turned the phrase over in her mind like a stone with a sharp edge. Outside the window of the small ranch house, the grasslands of the Pecos Valley stretched toward the Sacramento Mountains, golden and vast, and entirely indifferent to the catastrophe unfolding in this kitchen. It was October of 1881, and the autumn light fell across the worn pine floorboards in long amber bars, and none of it cared one bit that Oscar Easton had just sold off the eastern grazing quarter of the Easton Ranch to settle a debt he had never once mentioned to her. A debt she had not known existed. A debt that had apparently been accumulating for 2 years before she ever arrived. "I am not sentimental," she told him, and her voice was very steady, and she meant it with every practical fiber of her being. She was not a woman who wept over land or sentiment, or the romantic notion that a marriage of arrangement could transform itself into something warmer simply because she had chosen to stop being cautious about it. She had come to New Mexico Territory from Philadelphia for reasons that were practical and clear-eyed, and she had intended to stay practical and clear-eyed. "But I am your wife," she continued, "and you signed a document affecting this property without speaking one word to me about it. That is not a matter of sentiment. That is a matter of partnership." Oscar said nothing for a long moment. A muscle worked in his jaw. Then he crossed the kitchen, picked up the paper, folded it with deliberate care, and tucked it into his breast pocket like he was tucking away the entire argument. That was the moment Gertrude Doyle, who was categorically not sentimental, felt something crack open inside her chest that she was not prepared to name. She had arrived at the Easton Ranch in April of that same year, 1881, on a Wednesday morning after a journey that had taken her from Philadelphia by train to St. Louis, then south and west through a succession of increasingly dusty and dramatic landscapes that she had catalogued in her journal with the detached accuracy of a surveyor. She had written things like scrubby juniper trees, red soil, cattle visible from the train window, sky very large. She had not written anything about her feelings because she was not, and had never been, a woman who found her feelings particularly useful to document. Her name was Gertrude Annalise Doyle. She was 28 years old. She had brown hair and brown eyes, and a face that her late mother had diplomatically described as striking rather than pretty. And she had agreed to marry Oscar Easton through an arrangement brokered by the Reverend Thomas Alcott of the First Presbyterian Church of Santa Fe, who had written to her late father's pastor in Philadelphia, when word had circulated through certain ecclesiastical channels that a respectable woman of good character and practical capabilities was being sought by a rancher of modest but stable means in the territory of New Mexico. She had read the description of Oscar Easton twice, folded the letter, and said to her younger sister Clara, who was prettier and considerably more excitable than Gertrude, "It seems like a reasonable arrangement." Clara had stared at her. "Gertrude, you are describing a marriage as a reasonable arrangement." "Most marriages are reasonable arrangements," Gertrude had replied, and gone to find her writing paper, and composed a careful and accurate letter describing her own qualifications, which included proficiency in household management, some experience with livestock from summers spent at her uncle's farm in Lancaster County, an ability to manage accounts given her 3 years working in her father's dry goods shop before his death, and good health. She had not mentioned that she was quietly lonely, or that the thought of remaining in Philadelphia in the small house that still smelled like her father, and caring for a future that felt increasingly like a corridor with no rooms in it had been slowly suffocating her. Those were not qualifications. Those were feelings, and she was not in the business of leading with feelings. Oscar Easton had written back within 3 weeks. His letter was short, factual, and grammatically imperfect in ways that she found oddly endearing, though she told herself that was simply the appreciation of a woman who had helped run a dry goods shop for the nuance of communication. He wrote that the ranch ran approximately 2,000 head of cattle, that he had built the main house himself in 1875 and added to it twice since, that he had no family nearby but there were good people in the town of Mesilla crossing 8 miles to the south, and that he expected a working partnership. He did not promise affection. He promised fair treatment and honest dealing. She had accepted. The journey itself had been long and exhausting, and had deposited her at the Mesilla Crossing Stage Depot on an April morning that smelled of dust and blossoming sage and horse manure, which was a combination that the territory of New Mexico apparently considered a welcome. Oscar Easton had been standing beside a wagon, and she had known him immediately because he was the only man at the depot who was watching the stage with the particular expression of a person bracing for an outcome they could not fully predict. He was taller than she had expected. That was the first thought she had, and she immediately categorized it as irrelevant. He had dark hair with early gray at the temples, which put him at perhaps 34 or 35, a lean jaw, and those gray eyes that she would spend 6 months trying not to trust. He wore a plain dark coat over working clothes, and he held his hat in his hands, which she noted because it suggested he had made some effort towards ceremony, even though he was clearly not a man to whom ceremony came naturally. They shook hands. His hand was very rough. She thought, a man who works with his hands. She thought, good. He said, Miss Doyle, I am Oscar Easton. She said, I know, I am Gertrude Doyle. I have been on the stage for 11 hours and I would like water if that is available. Yes. He had looked at her for one moment with something in those gray eyes that she couldn't read, and then the corner of his mouth had moved in what she would later classify as the precursor to a smile, and he had handed her a canteen. They were married by Reverend Alcott in Mesilla Crossing 4 days later, in a ceremony attended by the Reverend, his wife, a neighboring rancher named Felix Medrano, and his wife Catalina, and Oscar's hired hand, a quiet young man of 23 named Eli Tate, who had apparently worked the Easton Ranch for 2 years, and had the manner of someone who had witnessed quite a lot and chosen to comment on very little of it. Gertrude wore her best dress, which was dark blue wool, impractical for the territory but all she had. Oscar wore a clean white shirt. After the ceremony there was coffee and a piece of cake that Catalina Medrano had baked, and then Oscar drove them back to the ranch in the wagon, and they sat side by side on the bench seat and watched the Pecos Valley open up around them as the sun began its long descent behind the mountains, and they were, technically and legally, married. This is your home now, Oscar had said as the ranch buildings came into view. The main house, a barn, a bunkhouse, stock pens, a windmill turning slowly in the evening wind. Yes, she had agreed. She had not asked what their arrangement would look like in practice. She had her own room, she found when they arrived. He had clearly prepared the smaller bedroom on the north side of the house for her, with a fresh quilt on the bed and a small chest of drawers and a mirror that had been recently cleaned, which she suspected Catalina Medrano's influence had something to do with. It was a kindness she noted and filed away. The first weeks had the texture of a careful negotiation. She learned the ranch's rhythms, the early morning feeding, the check on water sources, the endless maintenance of fencing, The accounting that she discovered was done in a ledger so chaotic and inconsistent that she had reorganized it within her first 10 days without asking permission, which had produced a tension that neither of them had spoken of directly but which had passed when Oscar looked at the revised ledger and said, after a long pause, "That is considerably easier to read." "I expect it is," she had said. She had begun to take on the household provisioning and the account management at the general store in Mesilla Crossing, and had met the town's modest social world, the Medranos, who were warm and welcoming, the storekeeper Amos Wheeler and his wife Nell, who were curious and kind, a woman named Pearl Vasquez who ran the town's small hotel and boarding house and who had very direct eyes and an opinion about everything, and various ranchers and their families who lived scattered across the valley and came to town on Saturdays for supplies and gossip, and an occasional argument that the marshal, a weathered man named Burl Satterley, had to mediate. She had also discovered in those first weeks that Oscar Easton was a man of a particular and difficult kind of privacy. He worked relentlessly. He was not unkind. He was capable of dry humor that surprised her, and of a focused attention when she spoke that she had not expected and which she found she valued enormously. But he kept some interior country in himself that was completely fenced, and she was rational enough to recognize that she was doing the same, and they were in this respect perfectly matched in a way that was either the best possible foundation for a marriage or the loneliest one imaginable. She found herself wondering about it sometimes in the evenings when she sat with her mending, and he sat with whatever document or ledger he was reading, and the lamp burned between them on the table, and the wind worked at the corners of the house with its low and persistent voice. She did not think of it as loneliness. She thought of it as the reasonable quietness of two practical people living a practical life. She told herself this quite firmly for several months. The trouble began in July, which was the month that a man named Gerald Purcell rode onto the Easton Ranch with 3 companions, and a manner that immediately put Gertrude's teeth on edge. She was in the kitchen garden when they came, and she watched from across the yard as Oscar came out of the barn to meet them. Purcell was well dressed in a way that was slightly too deliberate for a ranching man, with a dark coat and a silver watch chain, and a horse that was worth more than anyone in Mesilla Crossing legitimately needed a horse to be worth. He was perhaps 45, with a broad, soft face and small, pale eyes, and he shook Oscar's hand with the particular warmth of a man who is owed something. Gertrude had very good instincts about people. She had developed them behind the counter of her father's dry goods shop, where you learned quickly to read the difference between a man who was short on money and embarrassed about it, and a man who intended not to pay regardless. Gerald Purcell was not the first kind. She straightened up from the tomato plants and wiped her hands on her apron and went inside without hurrying, because she was not a woman who hurried visibly when she was concerned. She put a kettle on and waited. Oscar came inside 40 minutes later. He poured himself water from the jug and drank most of it standing at the counter, looking at the window above the dry sink as if he were reading something in the view of the barn and the blue sky beyond. "Who was that man?" she asked. "Business associate." The words came out flat, rehearsed. "What kind of business?" A pause. "Cattle business." She waited. "He is from Albuquerque," Oscar said. "He holds a note on some equipment I purchased before you arrived. We were discussing the terms." She looked at his back. "Is there anything I should know about the ranch's financial situation?" He turned then and looked at her, and those gray eyes were doing the thing they sometimes did, which was being entirely unreadable. "The ranch is sound," he said. "I have it managed." She had let it go. She should not have let it go, and she would revisit that decision many times in the months that followed. But she had let it go because they had an unspoken understanding that each of them kept their own fenced territory, and the ranch's finances before her arrival had technically been his fenced territory, and she had chosen to honor that boundary rather than push past it. She had been, in retrospect, too respectful of his fences. August brought a heat that flattened the valley into a shimmering copper plate and made the cattle listless, and the work harder and the days longer. It also brought 2 more visits from Gerald Purcell, both of which Oscar managed to conduct in the yard while Gertrude was occupied inside, and both of which left him with the same particular set to his jaw and the same way of looking at a distance rather than at her when he came back in. She said nothing. She watched. What she also noticed in August was that something had shifted in the texture of their evenings. She could not have named it precisely, but it was as if the careful negotiation that had characterized their first weeks together had gradually, without either of them deciding it, become something less like negotiation and more like habit, and habit had become something less like politeness and more like actual ease. He had started telling her things. Small things at first. The particular behavior of a bull he was concerned about, the opinion of Felix Medrano on a fence dispute with a neighbor, the news from the territorial capital that Amos Wheeler got in his newspapers. Then less small things. His opinion that the Cattlemen's Association was being quietly dominated by larger operators who were pushing out small ranchers through debt and legal pressure. His concern about water rights as more settlers came into the valley. The fact that he had built this ranch from 140 acres of scrub and raw hope when he was 25 years old, and had come west from Missouri because there was nothing left to stay for there. That last part he said one evening in September, flatly and without self-pity, and she had set down her mending and looked at him and said, "What did you leave behind?" He had been quiet for a moment. Then, "A farm that wasn't mine. A family I'd disappointed by leaving. A girl I'd cared for who married someone with better prospects. The usual array of a young man's failures." "Those don't sound like failures to me," she had said. "They sound like reasons." He had looked at her then with an expression that she had not seen on his face before, something open and slightly unguarded, and she had felt the tightening again in her chest that she had been doing a very good job of not feeling, and she immediately picked her mending back up and studied it with great focus. That was the night she admitted to herself, privately and with considerable irritation at her own predictability, that she was in danger of becoming sentimental after all. She was not happy about this discovery. Sentiment was a trap. She had watched her father, the most sentimental man she had ever known, ruin himself financially 3 times out of loyalty to men who did not deserve it, and she had decided as a young woman that she would be the other kind, clear-eyed, practical, undeceived. Sentiment led you into dark places. She had arranged her entire life to avoid it. And yet here she was in a kitchen in the New Mexico territory, listening to Oscar Easton describe the ordinary sadness of a young man's early life, and feeling as though someone had knocked loose a stone in a wall she had been building for 28 years. She said nothing about this to anyone. She was fairly certain her face remained composed. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark, and listened to the coyotes working their way across the valley with their strange and mournful voices, and decided that what she was experiencing was merely the natural result of proximity and shared circumstance, which was manageable, and that it would pass if she continued to be sensible about it. It did not pass. September gave way to October with a cold front that swept down from the mountains and turned the cottonwoods along the creek bottom brilliant gold overnight. And Gertrude was hanging washing on the line, and watching the leaves move against the very blue sky, and feeling a complicated and unwelcome happiness that she could not entirely attribute to weather or landscape, when Eli Tate came walking across the yard with a letter in his hand. "Came in the supply run," he said, and handed it to her, and she saw Oscar's name in Gerald Purcell's handwriting on the front, and she handed it back and said, "Put it on his desk," and went back to the washing, but her hands were not quite steady. 2 days later was when Oscar told her the ranch would outlast any sentiment. She had been in the main room doing the accounts when she found the discrepancy. It was not in the regular operating ledger, which she managed, but in the secondary notebook that Oscar used for what she had assumed were his personal notes, and which she had opened by mistake looking for a pencil. The numbers were not difficult to understand. Gerald Purcell held a note of $2,400 against the eastern quarter of the ranch, dating to 1879, when Oscar had over-leveraged himself buying additional cattle during a market that had subsequently moved against him. The note was 2 years overdue. Purcell had been extending it, month by month, at terms that were growing incrementally worse. And the most recent page in the notebook, in Oscar's handwriting, showed the calculation that had apparently resolved the matter. The eastern quarter, approximately 340 acres of good grazing land, signed over to Purcell's land company in full settlement of the debt. She set the notebook down and sat very still for a moment. Then she got up and waited. Oscar came in at midday, which was when the paper landed on the table. "You already signed it," she said, and he told her the ranch would outlast any sentiment. And she told him she was not sentimental and proved otherwise by saying nothing further and going to her room, and sitting on the edge of her bed for 20 minutes doing something that was not quite crying but was in the neighborhood of it. And then she splashed water on her face from the basin and went back out and began to make dinner with a precision and quietness that was entirely communicative, even though not a word was said. They ate dinner without speaking. Oscar made 2 attempts to begin a sentence and abandoned both of them. Gertrude ate her food and stared at the middle distance and thought, with a cold and furious clarity, that the issue was not the land, although the land was genuinely troubling. The issue was the secret. The issue was 2 years of accumulating crisis that he had never once found a way to say to her. Not even in September when he had talked about Missouri and young men's failures, and she had thought in her dangerous and sentimental heart that they were beginning to truly know each other. She had thought they were becoming partners. He had been managing a hidden catastrophe alone. After dinner she cleared the table and washed the dishes and then stood at the window looking out at the dark yard and the stars beyond the mountains, which were enormous and indifferent, and she said, without turning around, "How much did you get for the eastern quarter?" Oscar had not moved from the table. "Enough to clear the debt completely," he said. "We are free and clear now. And the cattle that graze the eastern quarter, we will consolidate. The carrying capacity of the remaining land is sufficient if we reduce the herd by perhaps 200 head. And you calculated this and determined it was the correct solution and signed the paper without once asking whether I had an opinion or whether I might have access to alternatives you had not considered." Silence. She turned. He was looking at the table. "Oscar." Her voice was measured and quiet and very serious. "I managed my father's accounts for 3 years. I came to this ranch with $230 of my own money, which I have since deposited in the Mesilla Crossing Bank account under both our names, as is proper. I reorganized your ledger in the first 2 weeks because it was in a condition that would have embarrassed a schoolboy. I have been managing the operating accounts for 6 months, and I have found efficiencies that have saved this ranch $12 a month in supply costs alone." She paused. "If you had told me about Gerald Purcell and the note in April or May or June or any of the months that followed, I might have found another way. I cannot tell you for certain that I would have, but I would have tried, and you would not have had to carry it alone." The words fell into the room and lay there, and something shifted in Oscar Easton's face that she had not seen shift before. It was not quite shame, though there was some of that in it. It was something more complicated and more vulnerable than shame. "I did not want you to think," he began. "What?" she asked. "What did you not want me to think?" He looked at her. "That you had come all this way to a failing enterprise." The silence that followed was long and different in quality from the earlier silences. Gertrude turned back to the window and looked at the stars for a moment and felt the complicated, unwelcome, entirely inconvenient emotion in her chest doing something it had no business doing, which was softening. He had been protecting her from disappointment. He had done it badly and he had done it wrongly, and it had produced exactly the catastrophic outcome he had tried to prevent, But the reason behind it was not what she had feared when she had first seen the paper. She had feared indifference. She had feared the particular arrogance of a man who considered his wife a subordinate rather than a partner. She had not considered the possibility that he had been afraid. She turned back around. "The ranch is not failing," she said carefully. It was under a specific and manageable financial pressure that has now been resolved at a significant but survivable cost. Going forward, you will tell me everything. Not because I require it as a condition of remaining here, but because we will not function as a working partnership if you are making unilateral decisions about our shared enterprise in private. She held his gaze. "Are we agreed?" Oscar looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through those gray eyes that she was getting better at reading slowly, the way you learn a country by walking it. "Agreed," he said. She nodded. Then she said more quietly, "And I am sorry you carried it alone for 2 years. That must have been exhausting." He looked at her as if she had said something he had not anticipated, and she went to her room before he could respond, because she had already been considerably more vulnerable than she had intended to be. And she needed a moment to collect herself before she did something truly inadvisable, like telling him that she had stopped, sometime in September, finding his company anything other than the most important part of her day. She lay in the dark and listened to the coyotes and thought, well, so much for not being sentimental. The days that followed had a different quality, not warmer exactly, not yet, but less armored. Oscar began doing something that she recognized, after a few instances, as an effort at transparency, mentioning his plans for the day before he went out, asking her opinion on small decisions, leaving the operation notebook on the kitchen table rather than keeping it hidden. She responded in kind by being less precisely contained than she had been, by occasionally voicing the opinion she would have previously kept to herself, by, once, telling him something true about her own history. She told him about her father. It came out one evening when they were discussing the Cattlemen's Association, and Oscar said something about a man who had trusted a business partner and been ruined by it. And Gertrude said, without quite deciding to, "My father did that 3 times. He trusted everyone. He believed the best of every person he met, and every one of those people he trusted used it against him eventually. And he died owing money to people who did not deserve to be paid because they had cheated him first." Oscar said, "Is that why you came west?" She considered being vague. She said instead, "I came west because my father left debts and I settled them, and when they were settled, there was nothing keeping me in Philadelphia except the habit of being there, and I have never found habit a sufficient reason for anything." "That is an honest answer. I try to be honest." "You succeed at it," he said, and his voice had something in it that was not quite a compliment but was more than an observation, and she looked at the fire in the grate rather than at him. November came with a cold that sharpened everything. The mountains collected snow on their upper shoulders, white against the enormous sky, and the days grew short and brilliant, and the ranch work turned harder as water sources needed daily attention to keep them from freezing. Gertrude had acquired proper ranch clothing by this point, practical and warm, and she was no longer a woman standing at the edge of a world she didn't understand. She knew the cattle by their patterns. She knew which fence line was most likely to give trouble. She could handle the wagon alone into Mesilla Crossing, and Pearl Vasquez at the hotel had become a genuine friend who told her things about the town and the territory with an honesty that Gertrude appreciated enormously. It was Pearl who told her, on a cold Thursday in November, that Gerald Purcell's land company was not, in fact, a straightforward cattle operation. Gertrude had been in the hotel having coffee with Pearl while Oscar was at the feed store, and Pearl had leaned across the small table in her characteristically direct way and said, "I heard something you should know." Gertrude set down her cup. "Purcell's been buying up land all through the valley," Pearl said. "Not just your husband's eastern quarter. He's got pieces of 4 other small spreads too, all through this same arrangement. Note holding and then converting when the ranchers can't pay." She lowered her voice. "The word from Albuquerque is that he's working with a railroad surveying company. They want a right-of-way through the valley and they want the land on the cheap, and Purcell's been assembling it for them piece by piece through bad debt. Gertrude was quiet for a moment. How reliable is this information? Reliable enough. My cousin works in the land office in Santa Fe. She wrote to me last week. Pearl looked at her steadily. The eastern quarter of your ranch is exactly in the middle of where the right-of-way corridor would run. Purcell didn't take that land to run cattle on it, Gertrude. He took it to sell it to the railroad at 10 times what he paid Oscar for it in debt relief. Gertrude sat very still and felt something cold and focused settle into her thinking, which was the sensation she always had when a situation went from difficult to genuinely dangerous and required her best capabilities. Does Oscar know any of this? I don't know what Oscar knows, Pearl said. But I know what he doesn't know, which is that there's a provision in New Mexico territorial law about fraudulent debt instruments. If Purcell misrepresented the terms or the purpose of that note, there may be grounds to challenge the transfer. Where would I find that provision? Pearl smiled slowly. The territorial statutes are in the courthouse in Las Cruces. And there is a lawyer there named Harriet Vance who handles land cases, and who has, I am told, a particular interest in cases involving exactly this kind of arrangement. Gertrude picked up her coffee cup and finished the rest of her coffee in 2 calm swallows and said, "Thank you, Pearl." She did not tell Oscar that evening. Not because she was keeping secrets, not in the way he had kept his, but because she needed to understand the full shape of the situation before she spoke, and she had learned from her father's example the cost of acting on incomplete information with a full heart. She wrote a letter to Harriet Vance that night by lamplight while Oscar read his newspaper. The letter was precise, factual, and requested a meeting at the lawyer's earliest convenience. She sealed it and addressed it and put it in her pocket and mailed it the next morning when she took the buckboard into town for supplies, without mentioning it to Oscar. The response came within 10 days. Harriet Vance wrote back in a hand that was clear and businesslike, and considerably more confident than most legal correspondence Gertrude had seen in Philadelphia, and the contents of the letter were enough to make Gertrude sit down at the kitchen table with the letter in her hands and take 3 slow, deliberate breaths. The territorial statute Pearl had referenced was real. There was precedent. And more importantly, Harriet Vance had already begun receiving complaints from other small ranchers in the valley about Gerald Purcell's note-holding practices, and she was in the early stages of building a case that, if the ranchers could be organized, might constitute grounds for a collective challenge to the land transfers under fraud. Gertrude put the letter in the pocket of her skirt and went to find Oscar. He was at the stock pens checking a calf that had been off its feed, crouching beside it in the winter mud with a focus and gentleness that she had come to associate with him when he was with the animals, a side of him that was different from the controlled and private man he was in conversation. She stood at the fence and watched him for a moment and felt the complicated chest tightening again and was now thoroughly resigned to it. "Oscar," she said, "I need to tell you something." He looked up. She told him everything. The conversation with Pearl, the letter to Harriet Vance, the response, the railroad connection. She told it plainly and in order, and she watched his face move through a succession of things. Surprise, then a kind of still anger, then something harder and more calculating that she recognized as the same focused cold clarity she felt herself when a situation became serious. Then he looked at her, and there was something else there too, something she was getting better at reading. "You did this without telling me," he said. "I gathered information," she said carefully. "I did not act on it. I am telling you everything now because I believe we should decide together what to do about it. That is the opposite of what I did." "Yes," she said, a long moment. The calf made a small sound and Oscar put his hand on its side, absently, still looking at her. "Then I should have told you about Purcell in April." "Yes," she said again, "you should have. I was ashamed of it." "I know," she said, and her voice was softer than she meant it to be. "But Oscar, that is exactly the kind of thing partners are for, not the easy things, the hard ones." He stood up from beside the calf and came to the fence and looked at her from the other side of it, and the distance between them was the width of one fence rail, which was not very far at all, and his gray eyes were doing the thing they occasionally did, which was being entirely readable, and what she read in them was something that made her throat tighten. "You are a considerable woman, Gertrude Doyle," he said. "Gertrude Easton," she corrected, almost before she realized she was going to, and the correction surprised them both. And for a moment neither of them said anything, and then Oscar put his hand over hers on the top fence rail, and she did not pull away. That was the day the fences came down. Not all of them and not quickly, because they were both people to whom things happened gradually and with a certain stubbornness. But the fence rail moment was the turning point, the place where the careful negotiation became something else entirely, and there was no longer any pretending otherwise. That evening, he moved his chair closer to hers at the table without making anything of it, just moved it, and she did not comment. And they sat closer together in the lamplight, and she read and he read, and the wind worked at the corners of the house, and it was, she thought, the first time she had felt genuinely at rest in longer than she could remember. She lay awake that night not with the anxious alertness she had grown accustomed to, but with something that was its complete opposite, a warm and steady awareness that something fundamental had shifted, and that she was not unhappy about it. And that was a feeling sufficiently new and significant that she spent some time simply experiencing it before she went asleep. December brought Christmas, and more importantly, the meeting in Mesilla Crossing organized by Harriet Vance, who rode up from Las Cruces on a gray mule and arrived at the town hall on a cold Monday morning with a leather satchel full of documents and the kind of contained authority that Gertrude immediately respected. Harriet Vance was perhaps 35, with dark eyes and a direct manner, and a reputation in the territory that Pearl had described as formidable. She had trained in law in Missouri and come west after the death of her husband, and had been practicing in Las Cruces for 4 years, handling cases that larger firms considered too complicated or too politically risky. The Purcell situation, she said, when she addressed the assembled ranchers, was both of those things, and she intended to take it on regardless. There were 7 ranchers at the meeting. Oscar was among them, seated beside Gertrude and Felix Medrano, and 4 others whose names Gertrude had not previously known but who had apparently all been visited by Gerald Purcell and his note-holding in the past 2 years. Their faces, as Harriet laid out the scope of the railroad scheme, moved through the same sequence Oscar's had: surprise, anger, cold calculation. The evidence was solid. Purcell had been working as an agent for the Southern Pacific subsidiary land acquisition operation for at least 3 years, using manufactured and inflated debt instruments to force land transfers from ranchers who could not afford to fight him. The territorial fraud statute was applicable. The challenge would require the ranchers to pool their resources for legal fees and would require cooperation with the Territorial Land Office, which Harriet had already begun to cultivate. "It will take time," Harriet said. "I cannot promise you will recover the land that has already been transferred, but I can tell you that in 2 similar cases in Texas and Arizona, the courts have found for the original owners when fraudulent intent on the note holder's part could be demonstrated. And in this case," she said, and opened her satchel and produced a document that she passed to the nearest rancher, "we have correspondence between Purcell and the railroad's land office that was obtained through the Territorial Land Records Office, and which shows, quite clearly, that Purcell was acting as their agent at the time he issued these notes." The room was quiet while the document passed around. When it reached Oscar, Gertrude read it over his shoulder, and what she felt was not triumph exactly, but something close to the satisfaction of a precisely turned lock. "I am in," Oscar said. Every other rancher in the room said the same. Gertrude, who had not been a rancher and had technically not been invited to speak, raised her hand. Harriet looked at her. "Mrs. Easton, The legal fee pool will need to be managed carefully, Gertrude said. I can handle the accounts if no one objects, and I have some experience with correspondence and documentation that may be useful in organizing the evidence. Harriet looked at her for a moment with an expression of uncomplicated respect. I do not object at all, she said. Oscar looked sideways at her as the meeting resumed, and his expression was something she was now quite fluent in, and it was not unpleasant to read. The months that followed were busy in a way that filled the ranch house with a new kind of energy. Letters went back and forth to Las Cruces. Gertrude organized the documentation with the same methodical focus she had brought to the account ledger, building the evidentiary record with a patience and precision that Harriet wrote to say was invaluable. The 7 ranchers met monthly at the town hall, and the community of it was something that changed the texture of Mesilla Crossing, drawing people together against a shared injustice in ways that made the town feel more solid, more itself. Oscar and Gertrude worked side by side through all of it, and the side-by-side nature of it was no longer the careful negotiation of 2 strangers. They argued sometimes, directly and without rancor, about strategy and priorities, and when Oscar was wrong she told him so, and when she was wrong he told her so, and they arrived at conclusions that neither of them would have reached alone. They ate together and worked together and talked in the evenings, and she had stopped counting the days since April in the way she had in the beginning, when she had been marking time against a possible future retreat. She was not retreating. She had not been planning to for some time. It was in February, 4 months after the fence rail moment, that he kissed her, and it was so thoroughly not a surprise that the most remarkable thing about it was that it had taken this long. They had come in late from a ride to check the northern fence line, cold and wind-burned, and he had taken her horse while she went inside, and she had built up the fire and was warming her hands when he came in behind her. And she turned, and he was right there, closer than she expected, and they looked at each other in the firelight for one moment, and then he closed the remaining distance and kissed her, very carefully and very deliberately, as if he had been thinking about the decision for some time and had arrived at a considered conclusion. She kissed him back with a thoroughness that she hoped communicated her own position clearly. They stood by the fire for a while afterward without saying anything, which was appropriate because there was very little to say. She leaned her head against his shoulder and felt the warmth of the fire and the steadiness of him and thought, with a certainty that was nothing at all like the cold, focused clarity of problem-solving, but was possibly more reliable. Yes, this, she said into the warmth of his coat, I did warn you that I was not sentimental. You did, he agreed. His voice was lower than usual, and there was a warmth in it she had never heard there before. I appear to have been somewhat inaccurate. Somewhat, he said, and she could feel him smiling, and she was smiling too, and it was entirely undignified, and she did not care even a little. Spring came back to the Pecos Valley the way it had the year before, with sage and heat and that enormous indifferent sky, except that Gertrude was no longer looking at it from the outside. She knew it now. She knew the sound the windmill made at night, and the way the mountains changed color through the day, and the particular voice the Pecos River had in high water versus low. She knew Oscar's handwriting and his laugh and the way he looked at problems and the way he looked at her, which were quite different but both contained something that she had learned to receive without armoring against. They had moved past the careful arrangement. They were, without either of them having announced it, simply in love. She thought this fact on a morning in March when she was riding back from checking the cattle with Oscar at her side, and the mountains were covered in late snow that was already melting in the morning sun, water running in silver threads down the dark slopes, and the valley floor was starting its first pale green suggestion of spring grass, and she looked at him, his profile against the bright sky, and thought, I love this man. She thought it as a fact rather than a revelation. She thought it the way you think. The sky is very large. True, and something she had been living inside of long enough that the discovery of it was simply the acknowledgement of what had always been the case. She did not say it that morning. She said it in the end on a Thursday evening in April, exactly 1 year after she had arrived at the Mesilla Crossing Stage Depot on a Wednesday morning that smelled of dust and sage and horse manure. She said it in the kitchen after dinner, simply and without preamble, because she was not a woman who believed in circling important things indefinitely. "Oscar," she said, "I love you." He looked up from the newspaper he was reading with an expression that moved quickly through surprise to something so open and unguarded that she had to work very hard not to look away from the force of it. "Gertrude," he said in a voice that was unsteady in a way she had never heard his voice be, "I have been in love with you since September." "September," she said, "when you told me about Missouri, when you told me those were reasons, not failures," he said. She thought about that for a moment, remembering the night, the lamp, the careful way she had picked up her mending immediately afterward. "I immediately picked up my mending," she said. "I know. I was alarmed by my own feelings. I noticed." "You said nothing." "I was also alarmed," he said, and the corner of his mouth did the thing it did, the precursor to a smile that she had categorized on their very first day and had been watching ever since. And she laughed, which was something she did more easily now than she had in April of the previous year, and he came around the table and kissed her, and it was, as it always was, very good. The legal case against Gerald Purcell moved through the territorial courts with the slow and grinding deliberateness that all legal matters preferred, but it moved. By May of 1882, Harriet Vance had filed the collective challenge on behalf of all 7 ranchers, and the territorial court had agreed to hear it, and Gerald Purcell had responded through his own lawyers with a counterargument that was, Harriet wrote, sophisticated but substantially weakened by the railroad correspondence that had been entered into evidence. Purcell rode out to the Easton Ranch one afternoon in late May, without his companions this time, alone, which Gertrude noted because it suggested he was feeling less certain of his position. She was hanging washing again when he arrived, which struck her as thematically appropriate, and she watched Oscar come out of the barn, and she stayed where she was because she was not going to give Purcell the satisfaction of seeing her retreat indoors. The conversation was too far away to hear clearly, but she could read the shapes of it. Purcell making an offer, Oscar listening with the particular stillness he had when he was angry and controlling it, then shaking his head once and saying something short and final. Purcell's posture changed, became something less soft and more hard-edged, and he said something further, and Oscar looked at him for a moment and then pointed, very deliberately, toward the road. Purcell rode away. Oscar came back across the yard and looked at Gertrude over the washing line, through the sheets and work shirts billowing gently in the afternoon wind. He offered to return the Eastern Quarter in exchange for dropping out of the collective case, Oscar said. Gertrude reached up and pinned a shirt to the line. "What did you say?" "I said the Eastern Quarter was not the point." She looked at him through the swaying laundry. "No," she agreed, "it was not." He moved around the end of the washing line to stand beside her, and she handed him the next shirt to hold while she found the pins, which had become a habit in the past months, the ordinary collaborative habits that built themselves up between 2 people who are working alongside each other every day, and which she had come to regard with a quiet and possibly slightly sentimental appreciation. "He may try to make trouble before the case is resolved," Oscar said. "Probably," she agreed. "But Pearl's cousin at the land office is watching the filings, and Harriet has already requested an injunction on further transfers pending the hearing. He is in a narrower position than he was in October." Oscar was quiet for a moment, holding the shirt, watching her hands on the pins. "You know," he said, "when I told you the ranch would outlast any sentiment, I was trying to explain why the land mattered more than." He stopped. "More than my feelings about being left out of the decision," she said. "Yes." She smoothed a crease from the shirt before pinning it. "The land does matter. I'm not arguing that it does not. But Oscar, you told me it would outlast sentiment as if sentiment were the lesser thing." as if the practical concerns of the ranch were the real ones and everything else was soft. I know. But it was sentiment that kept you working this ranch for 6 years alone before I arrived. It was sentiment that made you build it in the first place and refuse to let Purcell take it quietly without a fight. She looked at him. The sentiment and the land are not opposites. They are the same thing. The land is what the sentiment looks like when you build it into something. He was looking at her with that very readable expression, the open one that she loved, that she had learned to stay present for rather than looking away from. "That is the most," he began. "If you say sentimental," she said, "I will take that shirt back." He smiled fully, genuinely, in the way that he did not do for the world but did for her, and handed her the shirt. "I was going to say true," he said. "That is the most true thing I have ever heard." She pinned the shirt to the line. The summer of 1882 was not easy. The collective legal case demanded time and correspondence and travel to Las Cruces for 2 hearings, and the ranch work did not pause for any of it. There was a difficult stretch in July when a disease moved through the southern part of the herd, and they lost 14 head in 2 weeks, which was a genuine financial setback on top of the costs associated with the legal proceedings. Oscar absorbed it with a steadiness that she admired, and she worked beside him through it with the same. And when the worst of it was over and the remaining cattle were past the danger, they sat on the porch steps in the late evening and shared a whiskey that Oscar kept for emergencies and watched the stars come out. "We should name the ranch," she said. He looked at her sideways. "It has a name. It is the Easton Ranch. That is a description, not a name. I have always called it the Easton Ranch." "You have called it the Easton Ranch because you had not yet had anyone to discuss naming it with," she said, which was a slight liberty with the truth but not an entirely indefensible one. He considered this. "What would you call it?" She looked at the mountains, dark and massive against the starbright sky. "Something to do with those," she said. "The mountains, they are rather extraordinary when you get used to them." "I have not gotten used to them," he said. "In 7 years I have not gotten used to them." She looked at him, surprised. "Neither have I," she said. "Good," he said, and looked back at the mountains, and she leaned her head against his shoulder as she had done since February, which was a habit she considered entirely unobjectionable. "Two Peaks Ranch," he said after a while, "for the 2 highest." "Two Peaks Ranch," she agreed. It was not a grand name. It was a plain and accurate name, which suited them both. In August, Harriet Vance wrote with news that changed the shape of everything. The territorial court had found in favor of the collective challenge. Gerald Purcell's note-holding had been determined to constitute fraud under the territorial statute, given the evidence that he had been acting as an agent of the railroad's land acquisition operation at the time the notes were issued without disclosing that relationship to the borrowers. The land transfers were void. The eastern quarter of the Easton Ranch, along with the parcels taken from the other 6 ranchers, would be returned. Gertrude read the letter twice, standing in the kitchen, and then sat down and read it a 3rd time, and then sat quietly for a moment with the letter in her hands and felt something so large and warm moving through her that she abandoned all pretense and let it. Oscar came in for midday dinner and found her sitting there and said, "What is it?" with his voice sharp, because her face must have shown something, and she held out the letter. He read it standing, not moving, the way he always was when something was very important, and when he finished he looked at her. She said, "We get it back." He said very quietly, "Yes." He came to her then, the few steps across the kitchen, and she stood and he held her, and she held him back, and it was not a complicated moment, but it was one she thought she would remember for the rest of her life. The land came back in September, transferred through the court order, and Gertrude stood at the eastern fence line on a morning in early autumn and looked at the 340 acres that the court had returned, gold grass moving in the breeze, and thought about Oscar saying the ranch would outlast any sentiment, and thought about herself saying she was not sentimental, and thought about everything that had happened between that kitchen confrontation and this autumn morning, and felt. with a certainty that was both practical and entirely the opposite of practical, that they had both been wrong and both been right in ways that had, in the end, amounted to the same thing. Felix Medrano threw a celebration at his ranch that evening that included most of the valley, a very large fire, Catalina's extraordinary cooking, and a fiddle player from town who played until well past midnight. Gertrude danced with Oscar for the first time, which was not something they had done before, and he was better at it than she expected, which she told him, and he said he had learned at a barn dance in Missouri when he was 19 and had not had occasion to practice since, and she said they would need to change that, and he pulled her a little closer on the turn and said he agreed. Pearl Vasquez found her at the edge of the fire at some point in the evening and handed her a cup of coffee and said, "You look like a woman who has had a very good year." "I have had an extraordinarily complicated year," Gertrude said, "which has, against considerable odds, turned out to be a good one." Pearl smiled. "Harriet Vance says you were her most valuable outside collaborator. She says if you were not already occupied, she would try to bring you on as a paralegal." Gertrude looked across the firelight to where Oscar was deep in conversation with Felix Medrano and Eli Tate, and felt the warmth in her chest that was now entirely familiar and entirely welcome. "I am rather occupied," she said. "So I see," said Pearl, with the directness that Gertrude had come to love her for. They were married in the proper sense of the word now, and had been for more than a year. But what Gertrude felt in that autumn of 1882 was that they were newly married in a different and truer way, in the way that two people become married not on the day of the ceremony, but on the accumulating days of knowing each other, and choosing each other again, and building something together that neither of them could have built alone. She told Oscar this, or a version of it, lying in the dark on an October night with the wind doing its work on the corners of the house and the coyotes somewhere out in the valley, and he was quiet for a moment after she finished and then said, "I should have told you about Purcell in April," she laughed. "Oscar, I know I am going back to it. We have resolved it. I am still sorry about it." She rolled over to face him in the dark. "I know, and I still accept the apology." She could make out the shape of him, the gray lighter than the dark. "Do you know what I think about when I think about that day?" "What?" "I think about the fact that you thought you were protecting me by keeping it secret. You were wrong about the method, but you were not wrong about the motive. And I think there is something in the motive worth," she searched for the word, "worth not throwing away." The dark was quiet. Then his hand found hers in the bedding and held it. "I think about it every day," he said. "I think about how close I came to what?" A pause. "To losing you before I understood what I had." She held his hand and listened to the wind and thought about that. "You are not going to lose me over a land dispute," she said finally. "I am not that frivolous," he said, and his voice had the warmth in it that she loved. "You are not. You might have lost me over the secrecy," she said honestly, because she owed him honesty even about the difficult things. "I know that too. But you did not, because you are not, when it comes down to it, a man who maintains a secret at the cost of what he actually values. You just needed time to understand what you valued. You were very patient with me." "I was furious with you," she corrected, "and I stayed anyway." "That is different from patience." He laughed, low and warm, and pulled her closer, and she went willingly, and the October night went on around them, the wind and the coyotes and the enormous stars above the Sacramento mountains, and they were warm and together in the house he had built, and she had come to inhabit as fully as if she had built it herself. November of 1882 brought a development that Gertrude had been beginning to suspect for several weeks before she was certain enough to say it. She told Oscar on a Sunday morning in the kitchen over coffee, simply, with her hands folded around her cup, "I believe we are going to have a child." Oscar set down his coffee cup. He looked at her with an expression that went through its sequence very quickly, surprise, then something enormous and bright that he was not even attempting to contain, which she found so unexpectedly moving that she had to concentrate very hard on the practical matter of her coffee cup. "Are you?" he began. "I am quite well," she said. I am healthy and not excessively uncomfortable, and I expect to remain useful around the ranch for the foreseeable future. Gertrude. What? Stop being practical for one moment. She looked at him over her coffee cup. The expression on his face was the fully open one, the one she loved, and there was something in it now that was even beyond that, something that she thought she did not have adequate language for and was probably not going to find any time soon. She put down the coffee cup. "I am very happy," she said, which was the plainest and most accurate thing she could say. "Are you?" "I am," he said, with a certainty and a simplicity that matched her own exactly, which was perhaps the most perfect thing he could have said. And she reached across the table, and he took her hand, and they sat in the November morning with the sunlight coming through the kitchen window and the mountains visible through the glass and the ranch quiet around them. And it was, she thought, exactly what she had not known she was building when she came west on a practical and sensible arrangement to a man who had promised fair treatment and honest dealing. He had not promised love. He had not known he would find it. Neither had she. She was quietly and completely glad that they had both been wrong. The winter passed with a particular sweetness. The ranch work continued, because it always did, and the legal aftermath of the Purcell case required some additional correspondence, and she maintained the accounts and the household and the correspondence for Harriet's office as the land transfers were processed back to their original owners. But the winter also had long evenings by the fire and Oscar's hand on the small of her back as she passed, and the planning of small practical things that were also large meaningful things. A cradle that he began building in the barn in December, working on it in the evenings by lantern light, with a care that she watched through the barn window sometimes when he didn't know she was there. She had not told him about the watching. It felt private somehow, that particular sight. Oscar Easton, a man who had come to this valley alone and built a ranch out of raw ambition and stubbornness, and who was not, by any external measure, a soft man, working on a cradle by lamplight with the same focus he brought to fixing fence line and disputing land fraud, with the same hands that had held hers at the fence rail the day the fences came down. The land does matter, she had told him, but the sentiment and the land are the same thing. She had been right about that. Spring came to the Pecos Valley for the third time in Gertrude's experience of it, and this time she knew it completely, knew the smell and the sound and the particular color of the sage in the first warm weeks, knew the way the mountains looked when the snow came off them in April, and the peaks stood clean and sharp against the sky. She was by then unmistakably expectant, and Catalina Medrano had become her primary companion in the medical practicalities of the matter, having delivered 4 children of her own, and possessing both considerable knowledge and a lack of the particular fussiness that Gertrude found exhausting in people who believed pregnant women required constant, anxious supervision. "You are strong," Catalina told her bluntly, "and healthy, and you have been working hard your whole life. This will go well." "I expect it will," Gertrude said. It did. On the 15th of May, 1883, in the bedroom on the north side of the ranch house, with Catalina Medrano presiding and Oscar waiting in the main room with the particular frozen stillness of a man who cannot do anything useful, and is finding that condition nearly unbearable, Gertrude Doyle Easton delivered a son. He was substantial and loud and thoroughly healthy, and when Catalina brought him out to Oscar and placed him in his arms and Oscar looked down at him, Gertrude, who had been told to rest and was already sitting up, saw through the open doorway the expression on her husband's face and added it to the collection of things about him that she would carry with her always. She named the baby Thomas for the practical and unpretentious reason that it was a name she had always liked and that it had been her father's middle name. Oscar had no objection. Eli Tate, when informed, shook Oscar's hand with genuine warmth and said the boy had good lungs, which all present agreed was accurate. Young Thomas Easton was an energetic and opinionated baby who had a great deal to say about the world and said it loudly and often, and who had his mother's brown eyes and his father's determined jaw, and who Gertrude regarded with a love so fierce and physical that it occasionally startled her with its intensity. She had thought she understood her own capacity for feeling. Apparently, she had underestimated herself considerably. Oscar was a father of the kind she had suspected he would be, patient and consistent and entirely unperformative about it, which was exactly right. He held Thomas with the ease of a man who had handled animals his whole life, and extended to his son the same focused attention he gave to things he cared about, which was complete and steady and never showy. The summer of 1883 had the particular quality of a life that has found its shape. The ranch ran well. The eastern quarter had been reintegrated into their operations, and the herd was back up to its proper strength. The community of the valley, knit together by the collective fight against Purcell, had a solidarity it had not had before, and the town of Mesilla Crossing had small improvements that spoke to it. A new schoolhouse that Felix Medrano had been instrumental in organizing, a second doctor who had come down from Santa Fe, an improved road to Las Cruces. Gertrude had become part of the town, in a way she had not anticipated when she arrived as a stranger on a Wednesday morning in April of 1881. She served on the school committee. She helped Pearl Vasquez organize a community lending library out of the back room of the hotel. She continued, occasionally, to assist Harriet Vance with land case documentation on cases that came in from across the territory, because she had discovered that she found the work meaningful, and that her particular skills with accounts and records were genuinely useful. She had not lost herself in the ranch or in marriage or in motherhood. She had added to herself, which was what she had hoped for in coming west, and which she had doubted in the dark and practical parts of her mind was truly possible. Oscar watched all of it with a quietness that she had learned was not indifference but its opposite, and occasionally said things that made her think he saw her more clearly than anyone had ever managed before, which was a discovery she had still not entirely gotten used to and hoped she never would. One afternoon in September, 3 years after her arrival in the territory, she was sitting on the porch steps with Thomas, who was now a crawling and enormously determined 4-month-old with opinions about everything within his reach. And Oscar came up from the barn and sat beside her, and they watched the mountains in the late afternoon light, the two peaks sharp against a sky that was doing something spectacular with color the way it always did in September. And Thomas made an aggressive and focused attempt to eat a pebble, and Gertrude removed the pebble from his grasp with a practiced efficiency, and he protested loudly, and she handed him a piece of dried apple from her apron pocket, which satisfied him temporarily. "You remember," Oscar said without preamble, "when I told you the ranch would outlast any sentiment?" She looked at him sideways. "I have some recollection of it, yes. I was wrong." "You were not entirely wrong," she said. "The ranch does matter, the land does endure, that part was accurate, but I said it as if sentiment did not." "Yes," she agreed. "I said it as if everything that has happened in the past 3 years was the lesser consideration." She looked at the mountains. "What made you think about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was in the barn finishing a repair on the fence gate, and I thought about October of 1881. I thought about what you looked like when you said I had already signed the paper." He paused. "I thought about how close I came to losing the only thing that turned out to matter more than the land." She looked at him, and his expression was the open one, and it had 3 years of evenings and working mornings and fence rail moments and kitchen conversations and an October night in the dark and a May morning when he held his son for the first time, all layered in it. "You did not lose it," she said. "No," he agreed, "but not because I was wise, because you were stubborn," she laughed. "I prefer determined." "Determined," he conceded. Thomas, having finished the dried apple, reached in the direction of the sunset with a small and absolute fist, as if he intended to claim it, and Gertrude caught his hand gently, and he redirected himself toward her finger with focused enthusiasm, and Oscar watched this with an expression so completely unguarded that she let herself look at it for a long moment before she said anything. "Do you know," she said, "what I think was the actual turning point?" Not the fence rail, not the Purcell letter. Earlier than that. Tell me. October of 1881, when you came in with the document and I looked at you and you said the ranch would outlast any sentiment. She paused. And then I went to my room and discovered that I was, in fact, extremely sentimental about something. Not about the land, about you. She kept her voice even, which was a slight effort. I was furious about it. I had been very carefully not being sentimental for 28 years, and it had taken 6 months of your company to completely undermine the project. He was watching her very carefully. So I suppose, she said, that you were right about one thing. The sentiment outlasted the land dispute. It outlasted the Purcell case and the letter and the document and every practical argument I made to myself for why I should stay sensible about it. She looked at him. And it continues to outlast everything, which I find somewhat personally inconvenient and entirely worth it. Oscar put his arm around her shoulders. There on the porch steps in the September light with their son examining her finger with great scientific interest, and the mountains going gold, and the valley spread out before them, and she leaned into him as easily and entirely as if she had been doing it her whole life. "Gertrude," he said, against her hair. "What?" "I love you considerably." "I know," she said. "I love you considerably in return." A pause. "Thomas also loves you, I believe, though he is reserving judgment on a number of people and phenomena until he has gathered more data." Oscar laughed, and she felt it through his chest where she was leaning against him, that warm and specific sound, and thought. 28 years in Philadelphia and every reasonable and practical decision made, and it turned out the one genuinely practical decision, the one that mattered, was this one. This man and this land and this life built out of fair dealing and hidden debts and fence rail moments and the slow, unguarded accumulation of being known. She was not sentimental. She had proved otherwise. The years that came after had the quality of things built well and maintained carefully and loved deeply. Thomas learned to walk and then to run, and then to ride a small patient horse that Oscar chose for him with the same care he brought to everything. And the boy had his mother's appetite for information and his father's stubbornness about acquiring it and was, everyone agreed, going to be considerable trouble in the very best sense. The ranch grew. Not extravagantly, not beyond what they could manage well, but in the measured and productive way of a well-run operation. Additional cattle, improved fencing, a new barn with better water access, a garden that Gertrude had expanded over 3 years into something genuinely productive. The Two Peaks brand, which they had registered in the fall of 1882, became recognized in the valley as a mark of quality stock, which was something both of them took quiet satisfaction in. Harriet Vance came through Mesilla, crossing occasionally on her circuit of cases, and always stopped for a meal and conversation that Gertrude valued enormously. And the friendship between the two women had grown into something solid and long-standing, built on a shared respect for competence and a shared preference for honest speech. Pearl Vasquez remained her closest friend in town, and the lending library had grown to nearly 300 volumes by 1884, which Pearl and Gertrude both considered a genuine civic accomplishment. Felix and Catalina Medrano remained their nearest neighbors in every sense, and the friendship between the two families was the kind that gets woven into the fabric of daily life so thoroughly that you stop noticing it the way you stop noticing something as fundamental as weather or light. Eli Tate, the quiet young man who had witnessed the first year of the Easton marriage with patient discretion and said very little about it, had risen to the position of foreman with an easy competence that made him invaluable, and had married a young woman named Rosa Salazar from Mesilla Crossing in 1883, and brought her to live at the bunkhouse, and subsequently moved into a small house that Oscar helped him build on the ranch's southwest corner, which was an arrangement satisfying to everyone. The territory itself was changing, slowly and not always for the better. More settlers coming in, land under more pressure, old ways of life disrupted in ways that Gertrude acknowledged in her letters and in the school committee discussions, and in the late evening conversations she and Oscar had about the world they were living in. She was not naive about it. The Mescalero Apache, whose ancestral territory bordered the Sacramento Mountains she looked at every day, had been confined to their reservation by the United States military through means that she found deeply troubling when she understood them clearly. And she said so in the school committee when the curriculum was being discussed, and insisted that the children in Mesilla Crossing learn something accurate about it, which produced some disagreement that she absorbed without modifying her position. Oscar supported her on this, as he did on most things, though he was characteristically quiet about it and let her do the talking, which was the appropriate division of labor given their respective tendencies. In 1884, a second child arrived, another boy, who they named William and who was from his first weeks a different creature entirely from his brother. Quieter, more watchful, with his father's gray eyes and a tendency to observe for long periods before acting that Gertrude recognized and found endearing. Thomas regarded his brother with initial suspicion that gradually became a proprietary protectiveness that was both touching and occasionally rather overbearing. The night before William's birth, Oscar had sat with her in the main room while the lamp burned low, both of them quieter than usual with the particular anticipatory quietness of a night that will be significant, and he had said, not looking at her, looking at the fire, "The first time I was afraid." "I know," she said. "I could see it." "Are you afraid this time?" "A little," she said honestly. "Not of the practical matters. Of everything being so exactly right and adding something to it and not knowing whether." She stopped. "Whether it will remain exactly right," he finished. "Yes." He looked at her then. "It will," he said, with the particular certainty he had when he was not guessing but stating, "because it is not a condition of circumstances, it is a condition of us." She had looked at him for a moment and felt the warmth in her chest, the thing she was no longer even trying to classify or contain, and said, "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said." "Do not tell anyone," he said, and the corner of his mouth did what it did. "I would not dream of it," she said. William's arrival was, as Catalina had predicted, straightforward, and he was healthy and substantial and looked immediately like his father in miniature, which Oscar regarded with an expression that was identically undone as it had been at Thomas's arrival, and which Gertrude filed alongside all the other things she carried. The ranch, the land, the two peaks standing against the sky. The house that Oscar had built with his hands in 1875, and which had been added to and amended over the years until it contained all the evidence of a life being lived in it. The good account ledger, the lending library overflow on the shelves, the cradle that had held Thomas and then William, the kitchen garden visible from the window over the dry sink, the worn smooth place on the porch steps where they had sat on 100 September evenings watching the mountains go gold. The mountains were, as Oscar had said, not something you got used to. Gertrude had come to believe this was their particular gift. They kept you honest about wonder. They stood there every day, vast and indifferent and extraordinary, and if you looked up from the work of living, you could not pretend that you were in an ordinary place living an ordinary life, and that refusal to pretend was something she had come to think of as the territory's fundamental character and her own. She was not ordinary. She had not been ordinary in Philadelphia, and she was not ordinary here. She had come west on a practical arrangement and found something she would not have known to name as what she needed, and she had loved it and fought for it and stayed when it was hard and been honest when it was complicated, and it had been, in the end, exactly what she had always been building toward without knowing she was building toward it at all. She was not sentimental. She had a working ranch under a clear title, 2 sons with determined jaws and brown eyes and gray eyes respectively, a husband who loved her considerably and told her the truth and brought her coffee on cold mornings and looked at her the way she had spent the first 6 months in New Mexico territory, trying not to want anyone to look at her, a set of friends who were genuine and lasting, a lending library with 300 volumes, and the Sacramento mountains visible from her kitchen window every morning of her life. She was not sentimental. She had simply proved at length and with considerable evidence that sentiment, properly applied, was the most practical thing in the world. Oscar found her on the porch one October morning of 1885, 4 years after the paper had landed on the kitchen table like a verdict, and stood beside her looking at the mountains, and Thomas was inside loudly explaining something to his younger brother, and the morning was cold and bright and the two peaks had their first dusting of winter snow at the very tops. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She considered this honestly. "I am thinking," she said, "that the ranch has outlasted a great deal." "It has," he agreed, "and," she said, "that so has the sentiment, and that you were correct that the land endures." She looked at him. "You were simply incorrect about which would outlast the other." He looked at her and the corner of his mouth moved, and then his smile came, the full one, the real one, the one he did not give the world. "I have been known to revise my positions," he said. "You have," she agreed. "It is one of your better qualities." He pulled her close, there in the October morning, and she went, as she always did, and the mountains stood in their vast and permanent indifference, and the wind moved through the valley grass. And inside the house, Thomas was telling William something about horses in a tone of great authority, and the Two Peaks flag on the barn moved in the breeze, and Gertrude Doyle Easton, who was not sentimental, stood in the life she had made and felt it surrounding her completely, and was thoroughly and practically and irreversibly glad.